The sounds of whistles and honking horns have become common in the Twin Cities over the past month. Twin Cities residents have taken to the streets to both protest and simply observe thousands of ICE agents in Minneapolis and St. Paul. The federal government has accused ICE watchers of breaking the law. Our next guest says ICE watches have science behind them. Nicole Bedera is a Minnesota-based sociologist and author of On the Wrong Side and co-founder of the anti-violence consulting group Beyond Compliance. Welcome to All Things Considered.
Thank you for having me.
So ICE watchers will often honk horns or blow whistles or even follow agents in their cars. Last week, a federal judge ruled that federal agents cannot arrest or pepper spray peaceful demonstrators, including those monitoring and observing ICE agents. And many legal experts say their actions are protected by the Constitution. Can you speak to what ICE watchers are trying to do when they blow whistles or simply stand on the sidewalk and observe?
Yeah, a lot of what we've heard from the federal government in particular is the ICE Watch is going to escalate violence in the Twin Cities and across the state of Minnesota, that it's something that's intended to provoke ICE agents. But it's actually quite the opposite. ICE observation is a de-escalation tactic. And one of the reasons that it works so well is that a lot of our sociological research would tell us that most ICE agents entered into these jobs in part because they want approval and they want to affirm their masculinity in public. And ICE Watch works by surrounding all of these people who will only engage in violence if they can get approval and surrounding them with disapproval. So it lets them know a lot of people are watching you. We don't actually think this is a good thing for you to do. We're not going to think more highly of you for doing this. And we've already started to see the impact. There are countless videos of ICE agents doing things like abandoning their mission, deciding not to detain someone, deciding to allow an immigrant or a person of color to remain in their home or on the street without any escalation of violence at all. So something a lot of sociologists of violence know that people in the general public don't know is that there are two main groups that participate in violence and perpetrate violence. One of them is this really tiny group of people who are individually motivated to be violent. And so when someone says that someone being present could provoke somebody just by being there, they're really thinking of that group. But that's the least likely group that you're going to encounter. The vast majority of perpetrators of violence are really only doing it to seek status and power and acceptance from the community around them. And so if the community around them says, we don't want you to be violent, we want you to leave, it's not really surprising to a social scientist that they would say, okay, then I'm going to leave because people don't approve of what I'm doing.
With Minnesota being the focal point of where this confrontation is taking place across the country, what do you make of the idea of this attracting more people that want to be more, get more attention or might want to make things more tense?
On which side?
On either side.
I think it is a purely good thing for more people who oppose ICE to come out and watch ICE. One of the things that if somebody's hearing this from outside of the Twin Cities, you might be surprised to hear is that as much as ICE Watch has been painted as some rogue protesters, as extremists, it's actually just all of the neighbors on a block showing up to protect their neighbor, coming out of their houses in their bathrobes in the very, very cold weather we have, because they're reacting the same way that they would if they saw an ambulance show up in front of a neighbor's house or a police car, where they would want to come out and make sure that their neighbor is okay and make sure that they're safe. And so more people participating in a de-escalation tactic only promotes safety. It's something that only makes it less likely for violence to occur. Now, if there are people who are drawn to this on ICE's side and they want to join ICE because they're seeing what's happening in Minnesota, well, first off, I think they'll be very surprised about what it's like once they actually get here. And in those cases, I think from a general public's perspective, those are the people that we would hope that would never be permitted to carry guns in our communities. Because if their reaction is that they want to be hunting people, that they get excited by the possibility of violent conflict, that's the kind of thing that we should see as completely disqualifying for representing the government.
Talking more big picture as a violence researcher, what does your research tell you about protest interactions and just violence as a whole?
Well, protests are in general way less violent than people who've never been to protests would expect. Something sociologists find consistently is that when people attend their first protest, they tend to be surprised because the types of images that are most likely to circulate online or in the media are in those moments of conflict. But most of the time in a protest, Everyone is peaceful. Everyone is walking around. It can be a good place to make friends, to get to know your neighbors, and to meet a bunch of people who hold the same values that you hold. And in a protest of state violence, one of those values tends to be nonviolence and an unwillingness to participate in the kinds of escalations that people are expecting. Protests in general are a sign of a healthy democracy. And I think a lot of people don't think of it that way because protesters tend to come out when our democracy is showing signs of becoming unhealthy. But the fact that people are in the streets, the fact that people are able to assemble and say, express their First Amendment rights and say, this is something that I don't want to be happening, and look at all of my neighbors who agree with me, that's a good thing. That's something that should be celebrated.
Not too distant history, 2020, following the murder of George Floyd, all eyes were on Minnesota again following that civil unrest and the protests that followed. When you think about what is happening right now in Minnesota and the way protesters are organizing, how does this compare, or how is this different than what we experienced in Minnesota a little over 5 years ago?
You know, I think Black Lives Matter laid a lot of the groundwork for what we're seeing today. Just like the organizing that happened before Black Lives Matter laid the groundwork for Black Lives Matter. The fact is, the national media started to notice what was happening in Minnesota after Renee Good was murdered. But part of why she was murdered was because Minnesotans were already out in the streets. They were already engaging in actions like Ice Watch to protect their neighbors. That's what Renee Good seemed to be doing.
Yeah, because of Operation Metro Surge, early December, this was something that was already in the works, but the rest of the country, all eyes started to focus on Minnesota because of this. Didn't mean to cut you off. Go on.
Right. That's a better way to put it. Let me say that again. So part of the story of what happened around Renee Good's murder is that she was observing ICE, and ICE was engaging in retaliation towards these organizing efforts that have been well underway in Minnesota. And so I think there are a lot of people outside of Minnesota who think that all of this popped up completely spontaneously and completely out of the blue. But in reality, our neighbors and our communities have been organized in ways that were similar to how they showed up for people during Black Lives Matter. Things like handing out masks at protests, having water in case people were tear gassed, having food and snacks for someone who needs that for a health condition or is just getting hungry and needs to be able to eat to be able to stay. These kinds of really basic organizing components of what do people need to be able to show up is a question that Minnesotans have been practicing answering for years now.
What do you make of the way that the Department of Homeland Security and the president referring to ICE observers as being professional agitators? What do you make of that label?
It's laughable to me. Genuinely laughable to think that people would be paid professional agitators. And it really gives a sense that anybody who would believe that doesn't understand this scale of what is happening in Minnesota and just how many people are showing up to protect their neighbors, and that we recognize each other. That I'm not walking past a protest or ICE Watch in my neighborhood and seeing a stranger. I'm seeing someone who I've seen walk their dog every other evening at the same time. Of course, they're not people who are professional agitators. These are people that we recognize and know. And it is, I can't emphasize enough to people outside of the Twin Cities, it's a huge proportion of people who are living here. There's no way. It doesn't make any sense.
I think, too, just sometimes does the line get blurred here a little bit between who are protesters and who are ICE observers? I mean, there's some overlap there, but we're talking about different things, or are we?
I think you and I are talking about different things.
Okay. Yeah.
I think that the Trump administration is trying to blur that line. And right now, they're saying that if you donate to a mutual aid fund, or if you help your neighbor get access to groceries when they can't leave their house, or if you come outside when your neighbor is being detained, or if you help patrol a daycare in your neighborhood so that it's safe at drop off, those are people who they're labeling as protesters. And I think that's something that's really important for people to understand, is that to some degree in Minnesota, if you are going about your daily life and you happen to be present when ICE gets violent, you could be labeled a protester whether you intended to be or not. And the definition of protester that the federal government is using does not match any of the rest of our definitions of protesters.
Kind of to look at the flip side on this, we've seen videos of agents pulling people out of their cars and forcing people out of their homes, despite the presence of ICE watchers on the sidewalks. So what do you say to those who argue that ice watchers are not doing enough?
I think a lot of ice watchers are feeling like they wish they could do more. And I do think that the goal of people in Minnesota right now is to get to zero deportations, is to get to a complete abolition of ICE. There's a reason that we keep saying that we want ICE out of our community altogether. We don't want them here. And so I don't think anybody is comfortable resting until that is the goal that has been achieved. But that's not a sign that ICE Watch isn't working. It's a sign that people are committed to continuing to do more and more.
As a researcher and someone who thinks about this long before there is a national spotlight on the city, on the Twin Cities, what has surprised you as you've seen this unfold?
I think the most surprising thing to me is how quickly people of Minnesota were willing to put their lives on hold to respond to the crisis that we're in. And a part of that is that it wasn't spontaneous, that people had already been planning and thinking about how to protect their communities in advance. But one of the things that we sort of constantly see in the study of social movements is that there are a lot of structural burdens that tend to get in the way, that people get caught up in their day-to-day lives about how difficult it is to work, how difficult it is to take care of children, and just manage a household. That's a big part of why it's difficult for people to show up at a protest, is they just don't have time, even if they support the cause. And I think one of the things that has made me the most hopeful and has surprised me the most is just how many people have said, I'm going to move my day-to-day life around. I'm going to coordinate with the people I know so that we can all find a way to get childcare to show up and support people outside of our own houses. The degree of the community response and the way that people are organizing together is exactly what you need for a social movement to take off. And it makes me hopeful that a lot of what is put into place now in response to ICE is something that Minnesotans will be able to tap into in the future as well, when there are other injustices or other important political issues that they want to organize around.
Based on your research, do you have any thoughts on intimidation on ICE watchers and what could potentially have a snuffing out effect on observers even coming out and making their voices heard? I mean, if this stretches on longer and longer, and if there's a lot of intimidation tactics from the Department of Homeland Security, how do you think that plays out?
That's always a risk. But in this case, I actually am pretty optimistic. So one of the biggest risks is burnout, is attrition. It's things like people experiencing risks to themselves that they can't continue to take on over and over and over, or just the time commitment of showing up. But one of the things that we're seeing in Minnesota right now is that there's an incredibly deep bench of people who are still waiting in the wings to get started, that are doing things informally on their own, but the community's rush to support is so significant. I think that I'm less concerned about that than I would be in other social movements. One thing that I will say for anybody who's listening to this that's important to do is, if you donated to places like mutual funds or food pantries a couple of weeks ago, it's time to do it again. It's time to make sure that the financial resources are also keeping pace, not just people getting out in the streets. One thing that I want to add, I think a lot of the time we talk about ICE Watch as this intrinsically violent and risky thing, and there are some risks to participating in ICE Watch. But it is ultimately a de-escalation tactic, and it is a tactic of violence prevention. And so in reality, the thing that is more dangerous, and that I think a lot of Minnesotans are coming to realize, the thing that's more dangerous is doing nothing, because that guarantees that the violence will escalate, and that taking on some of those risks in the moment can, in the long term, make our communities safer. And in the long term isn't that long. If an ICE agent would have been violent and they would have roughed someone up yesterday, if no one was watching, the fact that ICE watchers are there is part of why that didn't happen. And, as someone who studies violence prevention, it can be hard to communicate to people just how much of a difference they're making. Because if those prevention efforts are in effect, you don't get to see the other version of what would have happened if we weren't taking this de-escalation approach. And so instead, we have to look to things like other cities or other authoritarian movements in other countries to see what happened in the absence of this kind of resistance. And when we look to those metrics, ICE Watch is actually safer than not having ICE Watch, even if it can at times be intimidating, if it can be a little bit scary. But what we found is that there is a lot of safety in numbers, and that those short-term risks really do avoid those long-term horrors. And especially for people who right now are not targeted by ICE, ICE Watch is the way to keep yourself from becoming a target in the future, to keep the expansion of targets from growing.
Nicole Bedera is a Minnesota-based sociologist, author of On the Wrong Side, and co-founder of the anti-violence consulting group Beyond Compliance. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you for having me.